Well, good afternoon. Is it afternoon? Yes, it's afternoon. So I'd particularly like to acknowledge all the traditional owners of the land and commit ourselves to full reconciliation with them. And I'd like to introduce now someone who's actually very much walked that path for many years, Father Frank Brennan, SJAO, to discuss Catholic education and our mission work in the wider community. He's going to explore today why educators do need to be listening, he will suggest, to the voices of the public square and in our classrooms, that words like Gonski and Royal Commissions and Ullaroos and so on, and plenary councils, that they are actually all part of what has to be incorporated. What is our Catholic identity? He will ask, in a society growing more secular with every census, where we're pluralist and apparently less tolerant of tradition and authority. And how do we incorporate all that? I'm really looking forward to hearing this and enlarge and refine students' minds and those of their parents. So please welcome Father Frank Brennan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you, and always nice to be introduced by Geraldine Doog. And I've been asked to consider the topic Catholic education and our mission or work in the wider community. I'll speak for about 30 minutes and allow 10 minutes for question. Although I'm told there's a timer here, but it's still sitting on 40, so maybe it's going to be an open-ended session. I'm the rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne, and our patron, of course, is St John Henry Newman. He was rector of the Catholic University in Dublin, which he established. He then returned to England and set up the Oratory School, and he wrote this in his journal on the 21st of January 1863. Catholics in England, from their very blindness, cannot see that they are blind. To aim then at improving the condition, the status of the Catholic body by a careful survey of their argumentative basis, of their position relatively to the philosophy and the character of the day, by giving them juster views, by enlarging and refining their minds, in one word, by education, is, in their view, more than a superfluity or a hobby, it's an insult. It implies that they are deficient in material points. Now, from first to last, education in this large sense of the word has been my line. Well, I think he accurately puts to us the challenge here in Australia in the 21st century. Our aim as educators has to be to improve the condition and the status of those we educate. And it has to be by giving them juster views, by enlarging and refining their minds, in one word, by education. So I would hope that from first to last, for you as Catholic educators, education in this large sense of the word will be your line. And if we're doing it, as Newman intimates, we have to expect some resistance, including from those students at times, including at times from parents, including at times from staff. So, given that the future is listening, we educators need to be attentive to the voices in the public square and in our classroom. The voices that speak of matters such as Gonski, the Royal Commission, the Plenary Council, and the Uluru Statement. What is our Catholic identity in a society growing more secular with every census, and in a community growing more pluralist and less tolerant of tradition and authority? Responding to the challenges of the day, how might we provide our students, their parents, and our teachers with juster views by enlarging and refining their minds. I note today there's been a fair bit of discussion about the Bishop's new document entitled Created and Loved, a guide for Catholic schools on identity and gender. I don't profess to be expert in that field, but I would hope that any such guide is informed by first-rate contemporary anthropology. I would hope that such a guide would reflect what is undoubtedly the best pastoral care of our students, particularly those on the margins. And I would hope that such a guide is informed by first-rate pedagogy and completely appropriate language. Being a guide, it's there as something for discussion, and we need to be able to discuss these matters with a view to creating more just views within our educational community by enlarging and refining our minds and those of our staff and our students. I've always found it useful in public life to be attentive to our critics. And at the moment, the Gonski discussion is ongoing, and I dare say with the change of government, we'll be hearing more about it. Once again, it's not a field in which I profess to be expert, but I think a good starting point is always to listen to our critics. So, in preparation for today, I read some of the writings of one Thomas Greenwell, who's a member of the Australian Education Union, and also Dean Ashenden, a senior honorary fellow at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. I may be doing them a disservice, but I have the sense that they're not great fans of the Catholic education system. Just a few points from their writings I'd like to raise. In 2011, 32% of children at public schools came from the most disadvantaged quarter of Australian families. By 2018, that figure had grown to 36%, more than double the proportion at Catholic schools at 17% and independent schools at 14%. For us, with our commitment to social justice, our commitment to the option to the poor, our commitment to principles of Catholic social teaching such as interdependence and solidarity, I dare say these statistics stand as a challenge. I don't purport to give you the answer, but I think it's a challenge which we need to address. Andrew Piccoli, when Minister for Education in New South Wales, told the ABC Drum program, "It's the ability of schools to select their students that creates inequity, which is one of the structural weaknesses of Australian education." Now, there's no doubt that we in the Catholic system, we have far greater discretion about choosing students than the state system generally. What then do we do about that in response? And over the decades, since the Goulburn strike forced the hand of government, Catholic schools have moved upmarket, effectively sending poor Catholic families to the government sector. Now, I simply put them out there as challenges to you if we are to maintain credibility in the public square. Because, particularly since the Royal Commission here in Australia, I find that people are not so much interested in what our church leaders might have to say. They're more interested in what we do, and they're more interested in how we structure our own arrangements. Are our own institutions truly reflective of the justice which we profess that should be available to all in our society? The Plenary Council, there were many challenges put before us. At the Plenary Council, in the final resolution, there was a call for a national forum to identify and respond to the needs of the diverse and distinct circumstances of Catholic schools in Australia. Are we being sufficiently attentive to those diverse and distinct circumstances? Also, to build partnerships which enhance the vision of Catholic education as an instrument of evangelisation and an essential dimension of the contemporary mission of the Church. I was simply at the plenary council as what was called a peritus, a so-called expert, to observe proceedings. I did observe that both Jacinta Collins and your Bishop Kennedy seemed to have some reservations about the wording of these resolutions, and that there might have been something better produced if there had been closer consultation with you as the education sector. Well, I trust now might be the time for that. Talk of evangelisation is challenging for us, particularly when an increasing percentage of the students in our schools are not Catholic. I had cause to think a little further about that entry that John Henry Newman had in his journal on the 21st of January 1863. He used to come under a lot of criticism, particularly from Cardinal Manning at Westminster, on the basis that there he was, the exemplary convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism, having left his plum job in Oxford and becoming then a Catholic priest after 1845, but he'd brought in next to no converts. And Cardinal Manning and his supporters were always very critical of Newman, and this stung him very deeply. He wrote, "To me, conversions were not the first thing, but the edification of Catholics. I am afraid to make hasty converts of educated people, lest they should not have counted the cost, and should have difficulties after they entered the Church. I do but imply the same thing, that the Church must be prepared for converts, as well as converts prepared for the Church." We might ask to what extent our school is prepared for converts, as well as the converts being prepared for our school. To engage in the public square, we need, of course, to be attentive to the prophetic voices. I've been very impressed of late on doing some reading about Archbishop Mannix, having returned to Melbourne after 30 years away. You'll be aware that Archbishop Mannix was Archbishop of Melbourne for 46 years, from 1917 to 1963. He used to live at Raheen in Studley Park Road in Kew, and a few hundred metres away was the Palatine College, where the Palatines had missions to the Aborigines in the Kimberley. And each year he used to walk up on a Sunday afternoon for the annual Palatine Fete. And the Argus newspaper, which was then the newspaper of record in Melbourne, used to attend. It used to be particularly interesting back in the days when Joe Lyons was the Prime Minister, because he was Catholic and he sometimes attended as well. So they would both make statements, very exhortatory statements, about the situation of Aborigines in Australian society. Let me just share two of them with you. The report from the Argus in 1938, after Mannix had opened the Palatine College. Mannix said that Australia was beginning to make reparation to the Aborigines for all the wrongs, wittingly or unwittingly, they'd inflicted upon them. It was encouraged that Australian youths were already offering themselves for service in the Kimberley mission fields. The blacks should be encouraged to live according to their own culture and to be a credit to white Australia. Now, we'd use language somewhat different nowadays, wouldn't we? But the challenges were there, and he appreciated them to be there at the time, appreciating that indeed there was a need for making reparation, admitting that indeed there were serious wrongs that had been committed, admitting that indeed Aborigines should be encouraged to live according to their own culture. 3 years later, in 1941, he went back to the Palatine College at the Fete, and the Argus reported, "White people in Australia had committed the original sin against Aborigines," Archbishop Mannix said. The original sin, he was afraid, had not been blotted out. The Palatine Fathers were doing their part to bring redemption to us from our original sin, which had brought suffering to the black people. Now, to think that these things were being said by our church leaders 80 years ago, but still with very little effect. Where were we as educators during those generations? And what will they be saying of us in 80 years' time? So, under the heading of Catholic education and our missional work in the wider community, I thought I might take as a case study our response to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. As you know, Aboriginal people engaged in consultations all around Australia, culminating in a major meeting at Uluru in May 2017, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. I'm fond of pointing out that though everyone talks about the Uluru Statement, very few people seem to have read it, and it is only one page long. For us as Catholic educators, I always think the starting point should be the third paragraph and not the more political statements towards the end. That third paragraph, which obviously is a quote or an adapted quote of some sort, because it appears in italics, says, "This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty." That adapted quote is taken from two of the judgments in the Mabo decision of the High Court of Australia in 1992. And in fact, the two judges were Justice Brennan, my father, and Justice Toohey. You might take some credit for the fact that they both received a Catholic education. And there they were with these lines, which you don't normally see in a High Court decision. They in turn were quoting from a 1975 decision of the International Court of Justice in the Western Sahara case. And they were quoting from one Judge Amoun from Lebanon. So isn't it extraordinary that here were Aborigines quoting not only High Court judges, but a Lebanese judge in a case regarding land title and sovereignty in Western Sahara. It turns out that Mr. Amoun, in turn, was quoting a Congolese lawyer by the name of Mr. Bayona Barmeya, who was appearing for the country Zaire before the International Court of Justice regarding the ownership of the Western Sahara. And so here we have these all but universal notions which are being espoused as principles of fundamental justice. What are we doing to educate our students, our staff, even ourselves, to be more responsive to those fundamental principles which were being spelt out by Archbishop Mannix 80 years ago? What are we doing to respond to these notions that we find here in jurisprudence which had been developed first in the International Court of Justice in 1975, then taken up by the High Court of Australia in 1992, and now being put before us by the respected Aboriginal leaders in Australia? So, what are we to do if we are actually to engage in the wider community on issues which are vexed, which are complex, which are political, but which are fundamentally about justice, fundamentally about proclaiming the kingdom which is to come, that kingdom breaking in here and now? What I want to suggest today is that I've always had a fourfold approach. The first is to ask, what is it that the marginalised, the disadvantaged group to whom we are addressing ourselves, what is it that they are seeking? What are they asking of us? What are they telling us about their life experience? And you might apply this not only to Indigenous issues, you might also apply it when you pick up the document Created and Loved, a guide for Catholic schools on identity and gender. First of all, to identify with the experience and the reflection on that experience of the people who are affected by the laws or policies which we are wanting to agitate. So we have heard it clearly from that group at Uluru. As they say towards the end of their Uluru statement, we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that, of course, all Aboriginal people will think the same, or that all Aboriginal people will ask for the same thing. So if we're to engage seriously in the social and political processes of our pluralistic democratic society, we have to be able to identify and then be attentive to the pluralist voices that we will hear, included from disadvantaged and marginalised groups. That requires attentive listening, and we should be able to provide that within an educational environment. One challenge I want to put before you is that it's not sufficient for us as educators simply to put a one-line answer as if this is what the Aboriginal people want, or this is what those who are confronting issues of identity and gender want. To be able to engage with the plurality of views, of experiences, and reflection on those experiences. Well, having made some assessment of what it is that is being sought in the social and political processes, there is then a need to be attentive to which of those aspirations which have been expressed are politically achievable. Now, as you know, Prime Minister Albanese went to the Garma Festival some weeks ago, and he announced a proposed formula which might be placed in the Constitution. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, this is talk not just about a change of policy or a change of law because there's been a change of government. This is talk about a change to the Australian Constitution. If we're going to be real educators in this field, it's necessary that we understand something about the Constitution. Now, that's difficult for us as Australians. We're not Americans, so you can be sure that most of our teachers have never read the Australian Constitution. I may be wrong. Could I have a show of hands, those who have read the Australian Constitution? Well, there is a sizable, probably 10% minority. I must compliment you all. Presumably you've done law degrees or something like that, because the Australian Constitution is, to be honest, a very dull and boring document. It is basically a rule book setting out the different powers to be exercised between the federal government and the state governments, and then the different roles to be performed by the Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary. Riveting stuff, isn't it? You won't find any great statements in there about human rights or any of the issues that get debated all the time by the US Supreme Court. There's one thing very democratic about the Australian Constitution. It can only be amended by a majority of the people, not by the politicians, and by a supermajority of the people, that is, by a majority of people in 4 of the 6 states, as well as a majority of the voters nationally. There have been 44 attempts, only 8 have succeeded. What's critical, and here I'm not being critical of Mr Albanese, but what's critical to understand about our history is the undisputed fact the Australian Labor Party has attempted to amend the Australian Constitution 25 times, and they failed 24 times. The only time the Labor Party has ever successfully amended the Australian Constitution was immediately after World War II, when they brought in a measure regarding child endowment and maternity allowances. You have to be over 97 years of age to have voted successfully in a referendum proposed by the Australian Labor Party. To amend the Australian Constitution, you need the majority of our parliamentarians to be on board, because once any campaign starts, you can be sure that you will hear the regular refrain, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and if you don't know, vote no. And with the complexities to be discussed with this issue, you can be sure that those cries will be heard very regularly. So there is a need for us to be able to engage in intelligent and respectful discussion about what is politically achievable. And if we're not prepared to do that as educators, then we're not prepared to play any real role in such a campaign in the future, except to give notional assent to what we might regard as something like a motherhood type proposition. So that is the complexity of the second question. First question, what is it that Aboriginal people themselves are seeking? Second question, which of those aspirations are politically achievable? And that requires a respectful dialogue amongst us all. Everyone deserves a place at the table. There then comes a third question, which is, which of those aspirations which you think might be politically achievable are morally justified? Some would say in the Australian public square that that is a classic piece of paternalism from a white fella Catholic priest, but I make no apology for it. Particularly for us as Catholic educators, we have to address questions about what we think is morally justified, what is right and true in order to achieve these Indigenous aspirations. For example, if you look at paragraph 2 of Mr Albanese's proposition, it is that the Aboriginal voice may make representations to Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Could I ask you rhetorically, do you know of any matters that don't relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Because in the 21st century, they being full citizens with all the rest of us, everything that comes before the Parliament is arguably a matter relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so we do have a fundamental question here, which is, to what extent should those who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders have a special place at the table in making representations to the Parliament? I think that is a quite vexed moral question. You might think back to 1988 when the new Parliament House was opened. The first resolution ever passed before that House was moved by Bob Hawke. The hope was it would be seconded by John Howard as Leader of the Opposition, which was an acknowledgement of the place of Aborigines in our history, their heritage and their future. It was put forward by the 14 key church leaders in Australia. In the end, it fell over because the opposition led by John Howard would not agree to a statement about the right to self-management and self-determination subject to the laws of the Commonwealth of Australia unless the words were added in common with all other Australians. Well, that debate in 1988 is still the debate that we are yet to have here about the voice. And there are moral arguments that can be put both ways. Well, there then comes a fourth question. I make an assessment. What are the aspirations that the disadvantaged, marginalised group are seeking in our society? Which of those aspirations are morally justified? Which of those aspirations are politically achievable? And then comes the crunch question for personal discernment. Which of those aspirations, or which formulation of them, would I be prepared to give myself to? Not only to vote yes, but to sweat on it, to give some blood, basically to do the hard yards. And this requires, once again, respectful dialogue within the community. Here's my own suggestion, that rather than having a voice which is both to Parliament and to government, which I think does risk gluing up the system of government and does risk cutting across organisations such as the Coalition of Aboriginal Peak Organisations, and rather than it being in relation to any matter relating to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, I think we need to admit that under our Constitution, in the 21st century, we still have a provision that says the Commonwealth Parliament has power to make laws with respect to the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws. In the 21st century, we would never use that provision for any group other than Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. Now, if we're going to contemplate in the 21st century making special laws relating to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, I think they are entitled to have special representation before the Parliament makes those special laws. So how about this, section 127? There shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice with such structure and functions as the Parliament deems necessary to facilitate consultation prior to the making of special laws with respect to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. Does that have any chance of success? Who knows? But in the end, as I say, not altogether facetiously, any proposal that doesn't get the tick from both Noel Pearson and John Howard, I would respectfully say that Mr Albanese is wasting his time. So the question is, what role are we going to play as educators, working for that bipartisan support and working for the education of our community? And for us as Catholic educators, to do it, if I can go backwards on this slide, always taking into account what John Henry Newman said, that our aim is to improve the condition, the status of those we educate and the community of which we are a part. How? By giving them juster views, by enlarging and refining their minds, in one word, by education. So from first to last, education in this large sense of the word should be our line. And I would hope that at this stage in Australian history, Catholic educators might play a role in helping us as a society come to due constitutional recognition of the first Australians 2 centuries too late. Thank you. So there's 9 minutes and 16 seconds for questions. Oh, so please, and don't be afraid to disagree with me, but please come forward and ask your questions.
Thank you, Frank. Rachel McLean from Cairns Catholic Education Community. I'd just like to ask, has there been any consideration about the Marsig statement? Thank you. Rachel from Catholic Education Community Cairns. I work very closely with the Torres Strait Islanders. Coming from a place of concern around the use of Torres Strait Island and the community there moving towards the language of Zenith Kes, language coming from that community, and the very recent proclamation of the Marsig Statement in August, which is an invitation to accompany the Uluru Statement from the Heart, Voice from the Deep. How do we ensure that all people, and the communities that we work with have asked us to use First Nation, how do we ensure that all voices are heard, particularly those furthest from us? So in this case, the voices from the deep.
Well, I think you've answered the question yourself. Unless Cairns Catholic educators are doing it, that is within the Diocese of Cairns, it won't be done by the Church. And so the Church needs to be particularly attentive to those dioceses in the more regional and remote areas, and it's to you that we look for guidance on these matters. Because, make no mistake, a lot of the politics that's going to play out on this will be posited, particularly people like Senator Jacinta Price, quite legitimately saying, look, I represent my mob, and I want to ensure that there's something in this for my mob in terms of improving their situation. And the complexities of this sociologically are enormous. Remember that since the 1967 referendum, the Australian population has doubled. In that time, the number of Australians identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in the census has increased 8 to 10-fold. Now, that's not just a natural increase. That's an increase of those who, quite appropriately, now more happily and more readily can identify or be identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. But guess what? The overwhelming majority of them don't live in the Torres Strait or in the remote communities where Jacinta Price lives. And so what they're saying is, look, we're not all just one mob, So anything in Canberra which is marketed as this is our voice, as I say, a national voice to be successful has to be really a very complex arrangement of multiple ears at local and regional levels, because you need those local and regional ears to hear the local and regional voices, which can then be channelled into your institution, which is then able to give national voice to what is being sought.
Thank you for that affirmation, and we'd love to work with anybody who'd like to know more. Come and check us out, Cairns Catholic Education Community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Sorry, you've got a long way to walk.
Father, my name's Kiralee and I'm from the Diocese of Sandhurst, and my question is probably more one about just a knowledge and clarification question. I saw that you used the word special in your rewriting of the section, and I saw that Albanese has also used not special, but a word that kind of asks about or pertains to rules or laws or decisions for Aboriginal people in particular. I'm just wondering if that relates to the special measures only in the Racial Discrimination Act, or if that is more broadly.
Right, thanks. Very good question, and it's a complex question. It relates to two things. First is, under the Commonwealth Constitution, section 5126, since 1967, provides that the Commonwealth Parliament can make laws with respect to the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws. Now, under that heading, the Commonwealth Parliament for many years has enacted laws such as native title, cultural heritage protection, languages, Institute of Aboriginal Studies, etc. So where you have those sorts of special laws which apply only to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders and their heritage, etc., then it is such a special law. But a second category, as you quite rightly say, and the best instance of it at the moment is, you'll remember when the Howard government enacted the emergency response in the Northern Territory, which included things like grog bans on remote communities, then it was specified in that law, this is a special measure under the Racial Discrimination Act, or for the purposes of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So my amendment is aimed at covering both. That if ever the Commonwealth Parliament was going to make a special law for Aborigines, such as on native title, or whenever the Commonwealth Parliament was going to make a law which was on a generic sort of issue, like alcohol bans, but apply it only to Aborigines and invoke that it was a special measure under the Racial Discrimination Act, then in both those instances you would have recourse to the voice beforehand for the Parliament then to make its decision.
Thank you. So ideally we would like the broader sense of consultation regarding laws, but also particularly to those special measures. Thank you, Father.
The problem we're all wrestling with is if the consultation is unrestricted in relation to any matters relating to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, I think you inevitably run into what is, in essence, a racist approach. To say, look, there are some matters that don't relate to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, or there are some matters that the voice wouldn't want to comment on. Well, Penny Wong, for example, as Minister for Foreign Affairs, has already announced that she's going to enact a First Nations foreign policy. Well, if even foreign policy can be seen as a matter relating to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, a fortiori, everything of domestic policy can be, including taxation.
Can I just ask you one very quick question before I go? if schools decide to actually act as a way of discussing this, what's a classic risk? Really problematic stage ahead, particularly justice.
Yeah. I think there are two major risks. One is simply platitudes of, a notional assent to whatever's put out there. I don't think that is an educational task. The other is to become absolutely embroiled in the complex politics and law of the matter, then taking a particular stand. I think it's trying to find that happy medium where we can say, as Newman would say, that what we are aiming to do is to produce an educated school community which contributes to a more educated community generally, because after all, everyone of voting age has to vote in this, and hopefully everyone of voting age will receive at least a modicum of decent education in relation to this issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank, very much indeed. And look, that really was very interesting. I'm actually going to attempt to do what you say on Saturday on my program, where we're trying to...
Good luck.
Yeah. It's well, that's the thing. It is so full of emotion that you stand back, which is completely useless and not doing my duty. Anyway, we're going to have two constitutional experts to just ask them very sort of cool questions, and then take it further. But I tell you, it is really quite challenging. Now, I'm going to hand you this From Humble Beginnings, commemorating 200 years of Catholic education, and ask you please to thank Father Frank Brennan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to take it? Yes, that's going to be a very good, very worthwhile challenge for us all in the next